Robert Hansen didn't look like a killer. If you lived in Anchorage, Alaska in the late 1970s or early 80s, you might have known him as Bob the Baker. He owned a small bakery, made pies, decorated wedding cakes, handed out pastries at church events. He was quiet, polite, almost shy, and no one imagined that behind that mild smile was one of the most sadistic serial killers in American history. Because Robert Hansen didn't just murder his victims, he hunted them, in the most literal sense. Robert Christian Hansen was born in 1939 in Esterville, Iowa, the son of a Danish immigrant who ran a bakery. His childhood was far from happy. He stuttered, had severe acne, and was painfully shy. Classmates bullied him relentlessly, girls avoided him. In interviews years later, Hansen would say that he built up a deep resentment toward women, particularly those he thought were too pretty to give him the time of day. By his teens, Hansen discovered two things he could control: a skill for hunting game in the Iowa wilderness, and a growing fantasy life that involved dominance and revenge. After high school, he joined the Army Reserves, then worked as a police officer in his hometown. But in 1960, at just 21 years old, Hansen committed his first serious crime, burning down a school bus garage. The motive? Pure spite. He served 20 months in prison and was diagnosed with bipolar disorder with schizoid tendencies. It wouldn't be his last time behind bars. In 1967, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska, with his second wife. The city was a frontier boomtown, fueled by oil money, military bases, and a constant flow of transient workers. The bars and clubs downtown were lively, and the red light scene thrived. Many women worked as exotic dancers or escorts, often traveling in and out of the city. For a predator like Hansen, it was the perfect hunting ground. Victims who might not be reported missing quickly, and a vast wilderness where bodies could vanish forever. Hansen's approach was calculated. He'd drive through downtown Anchorage late at night, spotting women working the streets or leaving bars. Sometimes he'd offer large sums of money for a photo shoot or a private date. Once a woman agreed and got into his car, he'd pull a gun. He would take them to his modest home, where his wife and children were usually away, and chain them in his basement. After assaulting them, he'd tell them he was taking them to his cabin. Instead, he'd drive to a small private airstrip where his Piper Super Cub bush plane was parked. He'd fly deep into the Alaskan wilderness, places so remote there were no trails, no witnesses, nothing but forest and tundra. And then, he'd let them go, not to set them free but to hunt them down. Armed with a hunting rifle and a knife, Hansen would track his victims like wild animals. Some tried to hide, others ran until they collapsed from exhaustion. None made it out alive. Between 1971 and 1983, Hansen is believed to have abducted and murdered at least 17 women, possibly more than 30. His victims were typically in their late teens to mid-20s, many of them sex workers or dancers. They were often found partially buried in shallow graves, shot multiple times, or honestly, never found at all. One of his early known victims, 18-year-old Mary Thill, disappeared in 1975 after leaving a downtown bar. Her remains were discovered years later in the wilderness north of Anchorage. Another, 24-year-old Sherry Morrow, was found in 1982 near the Knik River with a single bullet wound to the back. Detectives began to notice that several victims had been shot with the same type of rifle, a Ruger Mini 14. Still, the cases remained frustratingly cold. The women targeted were often considered high risk, and in the 70s and 80s, their disappearances didn't always spark immediate investigations. Everything changed in June 1983. A 17-year-old sex worker named Cindy Paulson was found running down a street, barefoot, handcuffed, and just totally hysterical. She told police that a man had offered her $200 for a private session. Once she was in his car, he pulled a gun, chained her by the neck in his basement, and assaulted her. The next morning, he tried to load her into his plane. But while he was busy loading gear, she bolted and escaped. Cindy described her attacker in detail: short, wiry, with bad acne scars and a stutter. She even described his home in the plane. The man she described, Robert Hansen. At first, police were hesitant. Hansen was a well-known community member, a successful baker, and even a record-holding big-game hunter. He had friends in law enforcement. But Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers decided to dig deeper. With help from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, they built a profile, an experienced hunter, skilled with firearms, socially awkward with women, living in Anchorage. When they searched Hansen's home under a warrant, they found jewelry belonging to missing women hidden in the ceiling. They found his Ruger Mini 14 rifle. Ballistics matched it to several recovered bullets. And in his attic, a hand-drawn map with over 20 X marks, later discovered to be grave sites. Confronted with the evidence, Hansen eventually confessed to killing 17 women. But investigators believe there were more, possibly dozens whose bodies remain lost in the Alaskan wilderness. He described his crimes in chilling detail, explaining how he released his victims and, well, gave them a head start. For him, the hunt was the thrill. The murder was just the conclusion. In 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years plus life without parole. He was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center where he spent the rest of his life. Hansen died in 2014 at the age of 75. Even in the dark history of serial killers, Hansen's case stands out, not just for his cruelty, but for the sheer remoteness and isolation of his crimes. His victims were literally hunted like game, deep in the wilderness, with no chance of rescue. Today, many of Hansen's victims' names are remembered only by their families and in cold case files. Some graves on his map were never found. The thought that there may still be undiscovered remains scattered across Alaska is haunting, and honestly, entirely possible. Robert Hansen was the embodiment of a predator. He hid in plain sight, wearing the mask of a quiet baker, while secretly living out his darkest fantasies. And for more than a decade, no one saw it. The truth is, in a place as vast as Alaska, monsters can live among us for years, and the wilderness can keep their secrets forever.